Good morning, Year 4. Welcome back to Year 4 Science. I hope you had a wonderful and restful half-term break. But we are back at school now, and it's time for us to continue studying living things and the environment. And today we are going to be focusing on food chains. So as usual, what you need to do is you need to go and get yourself a piece of paper if you haven't already got one. Get yourself a pen and a pencil so you are ready, and you can write down the title today, which is food chains, and today's date. I suggest you pause the video now so you have some time to go and get yourself a piece of paper and the stationery you need for today's lesson. Okay, so let's look at some key words that we're going to be seeing during this lesson today, and they are the following. We have obviously the title word, which is our food chain. We have things called consumers, we have things called producers, we also have predators, and we also have the word prey. All of these are going to be explained in detail over the coming slides. So you might be thinking, how does this tie into what we've been learning so far? And, well, the reason is we have looked at the teeth, we've looked at diet, and now we're looking at food chains. So we've talked about the different types of teeth and what functions those different types of teeth have. We've also looked at the specific diets that animals have based on the type of teeth that they own. Okay, so for instance, we have in this photo, we have a carnivore on the left-hand side, and we have an herbivore or omnivore on the right hand side. Very distinctly different two sets of teeth, okay, mostly because they eat very different diets. So making food chains. How do we show the animal's diet in a scientific language? How do we show that they are all connected together? Well, that is where food chains come in. Food chains are able to show an animal's diet in a kind of scientific way, and they are also able to show how or what the different animals eat, and then what those animals also eat as well. So basically, a food chain is therefore a map of what different animals eat from the beginning to the end. So now it's time to ask yourself, what eats what? In food chains, we use arrows all the time, and the arrows give us two bits of information. They show us what's been eaten by what, and they also show us the direction of energy flow. So where that energy's come from. So for instance, if me or you decided to go and eat a steak, we are obviously getting energy from that steak. That steak comes from a cow. What has that cow eaten to get that energy in the first place as well? So it shows us where the energy is coming from and where it is going to, but it also shows us what we are eating and what that animal has been eating as well. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, I haven't written anything down today, and you are correct, you haven't yet, apart from the title. But, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there is a pencil present. So, this is now where you need to write something down on your piece of paper. But it will all be very clear, and I'll explain what you need to write down nice and easily. So, first things first, we obviously need to have a definition written down for food chains. And our definition of a food chain is, a food chain shows where the energy goes in a food chain. In other words, what gets eaten by what. So you can pause the video now, and you can write down that top sentence at the top. And then once you've written that down, you can pick up your pencil, because you're going to be drawing a little diagram very shortly. So now that you've had some time to write down your definition at the top of the page, we are going to be drawing the following diagram. And this diagram is an example of a food chain. So we have a cabbage, and a cabbage is eaten by a little bunny rabbit. Very cute. Unfortunately, this bunny rabbit is eaten by things called stoats. And unfortunately as well, that stoat is then eaten by a fox. So this is an example of a food chain. You can see that food is produced at the beginning. It is eaten by a rabbit. So the cabbage's energy is transferred to the rabbit. The rabbit's energy is then transferred when it's eaten by the stoat. And then the stoat's energy is transferred into the fox when the fox eats the stoat. So what I'd like you to do now is to very briefly draw out that diagram as best you can. You don't need to do it in as much detail, okay? Just a little diagram and your labels to show the different stages of this food chain. So you can pause the video now and pick up your pencil and get ready to draw out your diagram. Don't forget to add your labels. They are super, super important. So what exactly does this food chain show? Well, it shows us several things. Firstly, it shows us that plants convert the sun's energy into food. Okay, that energy is then obviously eaten by the rabbit. And this is what the arrows indicate. This indicates where the energy is going. So the energy originally is obviously created by the plant using the sun's energy. And then that energy is then transferred down the food chain to the rabbit, to the stoat, and then to the fox. I would now like you to please add in these extra bits of information in the boxes onto your notes, please. So you can pause it now and make sure that gets done. Well, Year 4, now that I have given you an example of a food chain, it's now time for you to give me an example. So this is what you need to do. You're going to design your own food chain using the animals in your word search from the beginning of the lesson, and you're going to create as many food chains as possible. You need to draw it in your notes or in your book. You don't need to draw out the pictures of the animals. You can simply just write their names. Remember, okay, it needs to start with a plant. And are the arrows going in the right direction? Make sure that they show the correct transfer of energy. Again, here are some pictures of those animals from the beginning of the lesson. This is your time to pause the video and give yourself an opportunity to make your food chains right now. Off you go. Fantastic. Now that you have attempted your own food chains, and I'm sure they are all brilliant, I'd like you to keep them nice and safe because you will be discussing these with your teacher towards the end of the lesson on go-to meetings. Instead, what I'd now like you to think about is the following question. What makes this organism different to the ones that you have in your word search? Okay, so on the screen now there is an oak tree. What makes this different to the ones in your word search? Have a think about that right now. So what is it about this oak tree that makes it so special? Well, firstly, it is able to make its own food. It is called a producer. It uses the sunlight from the sun. It uses the energy from that sunlight to transfer that energy into food. So it creates its own food. Very, very clever. And this happens in a process called photosynthesis. And that's something that you'll learn about later on at school when you're slightly older. But another thing that's super important about this oak tree is the fact that it is able to allow a variety of different animals to feed off it. You have things like worms may eat the dead or decomposing leaves, flowers and fruit. Aphids eat the flowers and fruit. Caterpillars also eat flowers and leaves. You'll have the beetles as well. They will eat different parts of the oak tree, as well as things like squirrels that will eat the fruit, the nuts, some of the bark. And then you have things like hawks and foxes that will then feed off those other animals that are feeding off the tree. So the oak tree is at the center of this food chain in a sense that it is the key to all the different animals being able to survive and be able to eat what they need to eat. Okay, so your next job is to put the following into a food chain. It has been mixed up and rearranged for you. So what you need to do is rearrange it and draw it out in your books in the correct form. Now, you don't need to draw out the animals. You can simply just write the words. Okay, so we've got the grass, we've got owl, we've got shrew, we've got the sun, and we've got a grasshopper. Okay, think about what comes at the beginning. I'll give you a hint. It's in the sky and it's super bright and very warm. That's the start of our food chain. And then see if you can create the correct version. Just as a little bit of information or extra information, this is actually a food chain from Hampstead Heath. So somewhere that's very close to school and easy for you to think about. If you want to try and challenge yourself even more, you can see if you can add in these extra labels onto your food chain once you have drawn it out. But make sure that you leave enough space for the words to fit in, and also make sure that your food chain is nice and big and clear so that you're able to label it nice and easily. Okay, so let's have a check of our work and see if we've managed to rearrange that food chain in the correct order. Just before I give you the answer, just remember, does it start with a plant? That comes after the sun, as I mentioned, and are the arrows going in the right direction? So this is our Hampstead Heath food chain. Starting with the sun, obviously the energy from that sun is transferred by the grass into its own food. It creates its food, it's a producer, and then it passes that energy on to the grasshopper when it's eaten. A shrew then feeds on the grasshoppers, and then an owl feeds on the shrew. So our final consumer, for instance, is the owl, and then we've got the primary and secondary, the grasshopper and the shrew just before it. Well done if you got that in the correct order. If you didn't, now is your time to pause the video and rearrange it and put it in the correct order. So you may notice that I just talked about things called primary consumers, secondary consumers, producers, tertiary consumers, okay? And these are called the different feeding types. So different types of animals can be grouped in several ways. One grouping system is based on how the animals feed. Some organisms produce their own food, and these are called producers. Plants produce their own food, as we know, using the light energy from the sun. Some types of bacteria can also make their own food by using light or chemical reactions. Very clever. Other organisms cannot make their own food, and these are called consumers. For instance, we are not able to create our own food. We have to either go and grow it in a field using crops, or we have to rear it like animals do in farms. So what I'd like you to do here is the only things you need to write down, because there is a pencil in the bottom corner, is the writing that's in red and green. So just that sentence there where it says some organisms produce their own food, these are called producers, and the sentence in the bottom right about other organisms that can't make their own food being called consumers. That's all you need to write down from that slide. So we have just talked about producers, so it's now time to talk about consumers. Again, if you need to pause this to be able to write the notes down, then please do so, but just wait till I've explained everything that's on the slide. So consumers can be grouped into some different types. We've got herbivores. These consumers eat producers. This means that plants and possibly bacteria. So herbivores, they eat the producers. Carnivores. These consumers eat other consumers. Okay, they eat animals. They don't eat plants. Carnivores, remember, they eat meat. Okay, so they eat other consumers. And then we have omnivores. And these are consumers that eat other consumers, but also producers as well. Okay, so that means that they eat animals and plants. Most humans are therefore omnivores, because we eat both meat and we eat both plants as well. Now, again, pencil in the bottom corner, which means you need to write down, please, the sentences under the correct heading. So please write about herbivores, the carnivores, and omnivores. Should not take you too long. Okay, and finally, the last thing you need to do today is the following. Is it a consumer or a producer? What do you think? You're going to add labels to your food chain now, thinking about the word producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. Okay, you can do that for all the food chains that you have written out today. So the Hampstead Heath one, and also your own one that you wrote towards the beginning of the lesson. See if you can add the labels to those food chains now. Remember that producers are plants, they make their own food. Consumers are animals, they eat food. So once you've done that, you should have something that looks like this. Okay, you can see that the sun has the word energy above it. Our producer is our grass, and then our primary consumer, so our first consumer, is the grasshopper. The secondary consumer, the second consumer, is a shrew, and our tertiary consumer, or our third consumer, is the owl. The last thing for you to do today is the following. There is going to be a Word document on Microsoft Teams with a set of 10 questions for you to have a go at before you meet with your teacher again at the beginning of the lesson. So you can head over to Microsoft Teams and the worksheet will be placed there. 10 questions to do before the end of the lesson. Thank you very much, Year 4. It's been great to have you back, and I look forward to seeing you next lesson. Goodbye.